Right now, in hangars and on-ramps and in dealer lots from Wichita to Van Nuys, there are conversations happening that didn't exist in general aviation 5 years ago. Owners of older certified aircraft, Cherokees, Cessnas, Moonies, Bonanzas, aircraft with good bones and decent avionics and sometimes a fair amount of deferred maintenance, are doing math they've never had to do before. They're sitting with upgrade quotes in one hand and a regulatory calendar in the other, trying to figure out what happens to the value of everything they've put into their airplane after 2026, when MOSAIC isn't a proposal anymore, but an actual operating reality shaping what can fly, what can be certified, and what the market will or won't pay for work that used to be completely standard. If you're an owner of an older general aviation aircraft and you haven't dug deep into MOSAIC yet, or you've heard the name but written it off as a light sport story that doesn't apply to you because you fly something heavier or older or certified under a different rule set, this video is going to matter to you in ways you probably aren't expecting. Because what MOSAIC does to the upgrade and certification calculus for older GA owners is genuinely complicated, genuinely consequential, and genuinely underreported outside the regulatory and legal corners of aviation that most pilots never spend much time in. Before we get into it, hit subscribe because I cover the financial and regulatory side of general aviation in a way that's specifically built for owners who are trying to make real decisions with real money, not just follow along with what the press releases say. And if MOSAIC and what happens after 2026 is something you're trying to get your arms around, this is exactly the kind of breakdown you're going to want to have in your feed going forward. Let's build this from the ground up, because the details matter enormously here, and the nuances are where the real money is. MOSAIC stands for Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certificates, and while that sounds like a narrow technical change inside the FAA's certification bureaucracy, what it actually represents is one of the most significant rewrites of the light sport and airworthiness framework in the history of general aviation rulemaking. The final rule has been working its way through the system, and the practical implementation effects on the broader fleet, including the parts of that fleet that have nothing to do with light sport, are going to ripple outward in ways that most people who don't spend their free time reading federal registers haven't fully traced yet. The version of the story you've probably heard goes something like this. MOSAIC raises the weight limit for sport pilot-eligible aircraft significantly, expands what counts as a light sport aircraft, opens up a broader category of pilots to more capable machines, and creates new paths for aircraft to fly under the Sport Pilot Certificate. That's all true, and it matters, but it's essentially the headline version of a much more complicated document, and the headline version by itself doesn't get you to the part that should be occupying older GA owners specifically. What MOSAIC also does, and what almost nobody in the general coverage conversation is talking about enough, is reshape the competitive and economic landscape for certifying modifications, upgrades, and equipment installations in aircraft that exist right now today on your ramp or in your hangar. And it does that by changing the regulatory cost structure for manufacturers and modification suppliers in ways that will affect what they build, what they certify, what they price their products at, and ultimately what it costs you to put those products in your airplane. Let's start with the context on where upgrade and modification costs actually come from for older aircraft owners today, because you can't understand what changes without first understanding what the baseline is. When you want to put a new avionics system, a new autopilot, a new engine modification, or any significant equipment change into a certified aircraft, you are living inside the FAA's Type Certificate and Supplemental Type Certificate system. The Type Certificate defines your airplane as it was certified, its original approved design. Any meaningful deviation from that design, any new equipment installation that goes beyond routine maintenance, generally requires either a supplemental type certificate, which is essentially FAA approval for a specific modification to a specific type of aircraft, or an airworthiness directive compliance, or some form of field approval through a different pathway. The STC process in particular has historically been expensive, time-consuming, and highly specific. An STC for a specific avionics unit in a specific model of aircraft doesn't automatically transfer to a similar installation in a different model, even if the installation is nearly identical in practice. Each STC is its own regulatory product, developed by a manufacturer or modification shop, submitted to the FAA, reviewed, tested, documented, and approved at a cost that often runs into hundreds of thousands of dollars before a single unit is sold. Those STC development costs don't disappear. They get baked into the price of the STC'd product, or into the installation cost that shows up on your maintenance invoice. And as a result, certified avionics and modification hardware for older type-certificated aircraft has historically carried a significant price premium over functionally similar hardware sold into the experimental amateur-built or light sport markets, where the certification burden is different and lighter. You've probably felt this if you've ever priced a certified GPS navigator versus the EFIS display your experimental flying friend runs in his RV. The capabilities are often comparable. The certified version costs meaningfully more, and the reason is almost entirely regulatory overhead. Now take that backdrop and introduce MOSAIC's broader philosophy, which is essentially to widen the category of aircraft that operate under lighter touch certification frameworks, allow more modern manufacturing and design standards to be used without going through the full type certification process, and create a larger playground for innovation that doesn't require the most expensive regulatory pathways to participate in. At the aircraft level, that creates a new competitive dynamic. At the modification and avionics level, it creates something similar but more subtle and arguably more consequential for the existing fleet. Here's where it starts to get specific, and where owners of older certified aircraft need to pay close attention. One of the things MOSAIC does over time, working in conjunction with broader FAA modernization efforts around Part 23 and the broader light aircraft certification ecosystem, is lower the cost barrier for avionics and equipment manufacturers to bring products to market for a broader range of aircraft. As the sport pilot-eligible aircraft category expands significantly, as the line between what counts as light sport and what counts as standard category gets meaningfully redrawn, the addressable market for manufacturers building avionics and modifications under lighter certification pathways gets substantially bigger. A manufacturer who was previously building a product specifically for the experimental market, or specifically for the narrow old light sport category, suddenly has a much larger potential fleet to sell into, which changes their business case for pursuing broader approvals dramatically. What that means in practice over time is that some of the cost compression that has historically benefited experimental and light sport owners on avionics and equipment will start to bleed into the wider market in new ways. And that creates two very different effects that older certified aircraft owners need to think about simultaneously because they cut in opposite directions. On one hand, increased competition and broader market access for modern equipment manufacturers could genuinely drive down the cost of capable avionics and modification hardware for older certified aircraft owners over time. If the regulatory cost of getting broad fleet approval for a product comes down because the addressable market is bigger and more attractive, manufacturers have more economic incentive to pursue those broader approvals rather than staying siloed in experimental-only or light sport-only markets. That's a real and genuine potential benefit for owners of type-certificated older aircraft who want modern panels and modern automation without paying experimental aircraft prices for things that aren't legal in their certified airplane. On the other hand, and this is the part that almost nobody is talking about in the enthusiast coverage of MOSAIC, that same expanded competitive landscape potentially changes the economics of the existing STC ecosystem in ways that aren't purely good news for owners of older aircraft who've already invested heavily in STC'd upgrades. Think about it this way. If you spent $60, $80, $100,000 on a full glass panel upgrade with a current STC'd avionics suite in your Bonanza or your Mooney or your older Cessna 210, you made that investment in a market where the certified panel was your only path to a modern glass cockpit in that airplane. You paid the premium because the regulatory system required it, and there was no alternative. Post-MOSAIC, as that ecosystem shifts, if the path to modern avionics in a wider class of aircraft becomes cheaper and more accessible from a regulatory standpoint, the premium you paid for the STC certified installation becomes harder to recover when you go to sell. Not because your panel stops working, not because the work isn't real, but because the buyer on the other side of the transaction is increasingly aware that the regulatory landscape around certified aircraft upgrades is changing, and paying full price for yesterday's certification pathway is a harder sell when tomorrow's pathway looks like it might be meaningfully cheaper. This is subtle, but it's genuinely important. The value of STC'd upgrades in older certified aircraft has always been tied partially to the scarcity of the regulatory pathway that produced them. When that pathway was the only game in town for getting modern avionics into a certified airframe, buyers assigned value to the fact that the installation was properly STC'd because the alternative was flying with outdated equipment. As the landscape around that pathway shifts, the value calculus for existing STC'd work shifts with it, and owners who are planning to sell in the next few years need to think about how their investment in certified upgrades will be perceived by a buyer operating in a post-MOSAIC market. Now let's talk about engines, because the story there is different, and in some ways more acute. Older certified aircraft engines operate under a certification framework that is, to put it gently, extremely conservative. The type certificated engines that power the majority of the aging GA fleet were certified under standards that were state-of-the-art decades ago, and the modification ecosystem around them has always been expensive, precisely because every meaningful change to a certified engine requires its own certification process. Aftermarket cylinder manufacturers, fuel injection conversion suppliers, performance modification shops, all of them have historically faced significant regulatory overhead to get their products certified for use in type-certificated aircraft, and that overhead gets passed to you when the bill arrives. MOSAIC doesn't directly rewrite engine certification rules, but what it does indirectly, over time, is affect the economics of the modification marketplace by changing how large the market segments are that operate under different certification frameworks. And separately, MOSAIC is happening in a policy environment where the FAA has been actively examining its own certification processes across the board, including the Part 33 engine certification standards, and where the industry has been pushing for modernized approaches that reduce the cost of certifying modifications without compromising safety outcomes. For engine modifications specifically, the question older aircraft owners need to be asking is not just whether MOSAIC directly changes what you can put in your engine today, but whether the competitive and regulatory environment that MOSAIC is part of is going to accelerate or slow down the development of certified alternatives to the aging power plant options available today. Because if you're flying a Continental or Lycoming from the 1980s, and you're trying to decide whether to pay for a top overhaul now, or wait and see what the market for alternative engine options looks like in 3 or 4 years, the MOSAIC-adjacent regulatory modernization environment is a genuine input into that decision that you shouldn't be ignoring. There's also a specific dynamic around diesel and alternative fuel engine conversion for older airframes that is directly and meaningfully affected by what MOSAIC does to the economics of the modification marketplace. Several companies have spent years and significant money pursuing STCs for alternative fuel engine conversions on popular older certified airframes, and the business case for those STCs has always depended heavily on assumptions about market size and willingness to pay. If MOSAIC effectively pulls some of the fleet that was going to be the market for certified alternative fuel conversions into a different regulatory category where different pathways apply, that changes the revenue assumptions for the companies doing that STC development work, which affects how aggressively they pursue it and how they price what they develop. This matters practically because the cost of a diesel or alternative fuel conversion in your older certified aircraft is not purely a function of what the engine hardware costs and what the labor costs. It's also a function of how much STC development cost the supplier needs to recover per unit, and that denominator changes as the addressable market shifts around them. Owners who are watching the diesel conversion market and trying to time a decision about whether to re-engine their older aircraft in the next couple of years should understand that the pricing dynamics for those conversions are not static. They're actively being recalculated by suppliers who are themselves trying to figure out what the post-MOSAIC market looks like for their products. Let's talk about the autopilot and envelope protection market specifically, because this is probably the highest stakes upgrade category for most older aircraft owners, and the one where the MOSAIC effect is going to be felt most directly in the near term. Modern autopilots with envelope protection, automatic level mode, electronic stability augmentation, these have genuinely transformed the safety profile of general aviation in the last decade, and the data on their effectiveness at preventing loss of control accidents is real and compelling. Getting these systems into older certified aircraft has required STCs from the manufacturers who make them, and the major players have done an impressive job expanding the list of aircraft they cover. But that list is not unlimited, and the cost of getting full STC coverage for every model of older aircraft in the fleet has always been a limiting factor. There are plenty of airframes out there that fly under type certificates, where the modern autopilot options are limited or non-existent because the supplier hasn't been able to make the STC development economics work for that particular model. Post-MOSAIC, two things happen to this market simultaneously, and you need to understand both. First, For the aircraft that move into new MOSAIC-eligible categories, the regulatory pathway for adding modern avionics and autopilot capability potentially becomes more accessible and less expensive, which is straightforwardly good for owners of those aircraft. If your airplane, after MOSAIC, is now eligible to fly under the expanded light sport framework, the installation and approval pathway for modern avionics in that airplane may look different and cheaper than it did before, which means that upgrade that was previously cost-prohibitive might become realistic. Second, for aircraft that remain in the standard type certificate world and don't benefit from MOSAIC eligibility, the competitive dynamic shifts in a more complicated way. On one hand, there's genuine reason to hope that the broader expansion of the light sport market creates competitive pressure and economies of scale that eventually make certified avionics and autopilots cheaper across the board as manufacturers get bigger and more efficient. On the other hand, if MOSAIC successfully pulls a portion of the market into lighter touch certification pathways, some avionics manufacturers may rationally redirect development resources toward that growing segment, rather than toward the smaller, more expensive to serve legacy certified aircraft segment. Whether that makes your upgrade options better or worse depends entirely on which side of the new dividing line your specific aircraft falls on. And this is where the personal calculus for individual aircraft owners gets genuinely complicated in a way that's worth slowing down on. Right now, today, in the period before MOSAIC implementation is fully in effect, you have clarity about what regulatory framework your aircraft operates in. You know what pathways exist for upgrades, you know what your approved equipment options are, and you know roughly what certified installations cost, because the market for them is established. That clarity has real value when you're making investment decisions about your aircraft. You can price a panel upgrade, get competing quotes, decide what makes sense for your mission and your hold period, and execute accordingly. As MOSAIC implementation unfolds post-2026, some of that clarity temporarily goes away. Not permanently. The regulatory picture will restabilize. It always does. But during the transition period, there are genuine open questions about how the market for certified upgrades in legacy aircraft is going to price itself. How aggressively will avionics manufacturers pursue expanded approvals for the new MOSAIC-eligible fleet versus staying focused on existing STC coverage they've already paid to develop? How will the STC resale value of existing certified installations in older aircraft be perceived by buyers who know the landscape is shifting? How will insurance underwriters, who are very closely attentive to avionics and equipment certification status, respond to installations done during a transition period under pathways that may be new or ambiguous? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the practical operational questions that determine what you should or shouldn't spend money on in your airplane between now and the time the post-MOSAIC market stabilizes into a new normal. And getting them wrong is expensive in both directions. Spend too early on a certified upgrade that the market subsequently devalues, and you've overpaid for something the next buyer won't fully credit. Wait too long and miss a genuine window of still reasonable pricing before demand for modern avionics in your class of aircraft drives prices up, and you've left real capability and real safety on the table. Let's spend some time on what the MOSAIC weight expansion means specifically for the used aircraft market and how that ripples into the upgrade economics for older certified owners, because this is a connecting thread that I don't see discussed nearly enough. The expansion of the sport pilot-eligible aircraft weight ceiling means a meaningful number of aircraft that previously could only be flown by holders of at least a private pilot certificate are now accessible to sport pilot certificate holders. That sounds like a pilot certificate story, not an aircraft economics story, but it's absolutely both. Every aircraft that becomes sport pilot eligible under the new weight limits is now accessible to a buyer pool that previously couldn't legally purchase it for their certificate level. That increases demand for those specific aircraft. Increased demand, holding supply constant, puts upward pressure on prices. Owners of aircraft in that newly eligible weight range who've been sitting on relatively flat market values for their airframes may see meaningful appreciation as the expanded buyer pool competes for a fleet that isn't getting any bigger. But here's where it ties directly into upgrade economics. If the market value of your aircraft goes up because MOSAIC expansion has made it attractive to a newly eligible buyer pool, the upgrade investment math changes underneath you. An avionics upgrade that would have cost you 10% of your airplane's current value might now cost you 7% of its appreciated value, which changes whether that upgrade pencils out in terms of value added. Conversely, an upgrade that represented a reasonable investment relative to the airplane's value might suddenly look like an overinvestment once you recalculate it against the appreciated hull value. This is the kind of secondary effect that doesn't make it into the press releases about MOSAIC, but absolutely makes it into the financial decisions of owners who are trying to manage their aircraft investment intelligently. You need to know whether your specific aircraft is likely to see value appreciation from the MOSAIC weight expansion, and that requires knowing where your aircraft sits relative to the new eligibility thresholds and how many buyers who were previously locked out are now legally in your market. There are aircraft that are going to win this particular dynamic clearly. Certain models that sit in the weight range just above the old Sport Pilot limit, but comfortably within the new expanded limit, are going to see real demand increases from Sport Pilot certificate holders who now have access to something faster, roomier, and more capable than what they were previously limited to. The owners of those aircraft who understand this are going to be able to make much better decisions about whether to upgrade now, hold, or sell into the newly expanded demand. The owners who don't connect the MOSAIC eligibility dots to their specific airframe are going to be making financial decisions based on incomplete information, and that gap has real dollar consequences. Now let's talk about the certification cost side of the equation from the maintenance and modification shop perspective, because this is a perspective that almost nobody covers for aircraft owners, and it has direct implications for what you're going to pay for certified work going forward. Modification shops, avionics installers, and companies that develop and sell STCs have always operated in an environment where the cost of FAA regulatory compliance, the DER time, the engineering documentation, the flight testing, the certification coordination is substantial and non-negotiable. That cost has been rising, not falling, over the past decade, as the regulatory process has gotten more demanding and the expertise to navigate it has become harder and more expensive to find. A small modification shop that used to be able to handle STC development work with an in-house DER and reasonable flight testing costs is now often looking at a process that costs 2 or 3 times what it did 15 years ago in real terms. MOSAIC, to the extent it creates alternative pathways for modifications to aircraft that now fall under lighter touch certification frameworks, potentially gives some of those shops a relief valve. If a modification they've been trying to certify for a certain class of aircraft is now eligible for a lighter approval pathway because the aircraft has moved into a new regulatory category, the development cost drops meaningfully, and that cost reduction can flow through to the price of the modification itself. But, and this is critical, that relief valve only applies to the aircraft that actually move into the new category. For older certified aircraft that remain firmly in the standard type certificate world regardless of MOSAIC, the modification shop's cost structure doesn't change. The DER hours are the same, the FAA coordination timeline is the same, the flight test requirements are the same. If anything, those costs continue to rise as they have been. And if MOSAIC successfully pulls some of the more accessible segments of the fleet out of the STC market and into lighter approval pathways, the remaining STC market may actually get more concentrated among the harder, more expensive cases, potentially making certified modification work for older standard category aircraft even more expensive per unit rather than less. This is the scenario that should be on the radar of anyone who owns an older Bonanza, Mooney, older Cessna 182 or 210, Commander, or any other aircraft that sits squarely in the standard category and isn't going anywhere near the light sport eligibility thresholds, regardless of what MOSAIC does. For those owners, the question isn't whether MOSAIC helps them directly. It largely doesn't, not in the near term, but whether the ripple effects of MOSAIC on the modification marketplace make it smarter to do planned upgrades before the market reprices or after. And the honest answer to that question depends heavily on what the specific upgrade is, what shop you're using, what your hold period on the aircraft is, and what your exit strategy looks like. It is not a one-size-fits-all answer, which is precisely why this topic deserves more careful analysis than the general aviation press has given it. Let me walk through a few specific upgrade categories in more detail, because the MOSAIC effect is different depending on what you're talking about putting in or on your airplane. Start with glass panel replacements. If you're flying an older certified aircraft with an analog steam gauge panel and you've been contemplating a glass upgrade, your calculus right now involves several competing factors that MOSAIC has directly or indirectly touched. On the demand side, The expanded MOSAIC-eligible aircraft fleet creates more potential buyers for glass panel avionics across a wider range of aircraft, which is generally a reason for avionics manufacturers to stay aggressive about developing and pricing their STC products competitively. The major avionics manufacturers know that the post-MOSAIC ecosystem represents a larger potential fleet for their products, and they have every incentive to pursue broad approvals that cover as much of that fleet as possible. That's a reason to expect continued or potentially improving STC availability for glass upgrades across a wide range of certified aircraft, even older ones, because the manufacturer's incentive to get their products broadly certified remains strong. On the cost side, the question is whether the regulatory modernization philosophy underlying MOSAIC flows into a meaningfully easier STC process for avionics manufacturers over time. If the FAA's broader modernization posture under MOSAIC produces a generally more efficient STC process, not just for light sport-eligible aircraft but across the board, then the development cost for avionics manufacturers comes down, which flows through to installation costs. If MOSAIC-era modernization stays siloed to the light sport and expanded sport pilot-eligible category, the cost trajectory for STCs in older standard category aircraft continues on its existing path, which is generally upward. Most credible observers of the regulatory process are expecting something in between: meaningful reform of certification processes that benefits the light sport adjacent categories most directly, with some spillover benefit to the broader fleet over time, but not a dramatic near-term revolution in STC costs for older certified aircraft. For planning purposes, that means glass panel upgrade costs for standard category certified aircraft are unlikely to drop dramatically in the next 2 or 3 years, which is a reason to do planned upgrades on a timeline driven by your mission and your financial situation, rather than by waiting for a post-MOSAIC cost reduction that may take longer to arrive than the regulatory timeline suggests. Move to autopilot with envelope protection, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the upgrade category with the most direct safety and insurance implications. The dynamic here is similar to glass panels, but with an added layer. Insurance underwriters have, in recent years, increasingly treated the presence or absence of modern envelope protection autopilots as a significant rating factor, and in some cases, an insurability threshold. Policies written in the next couple of years are likely to continue moving in the direction of crediting or even requiring modern safety automation for high-performance aircraft, older aircraft, or operations in certain weather categories. That insurance dynamic is essentially independent of MOSAIC. The underwriting market is responding to actual accident data and to the documented safety benefits of these systems, and that response doesn't pause while FAA rulemaking works its way through the system. For older certified aircraft owners who are flying complex, high-performance airplanes and care about their insurance terms, the calculus on an envelope protection autopilot upgrade is increasingly being driven by what the insurance market requires, rather than purely by what the owner prefers to spend. That dynamic makes the decision less about market timing and more about getting it done before the insurance conversation forces the issue on less favorable terms. The MOSAIC adjacent factor here is specifically for owners whose aircraft might fall near the edge of the new eligibility thresholds. If your aircraft, post-MOSAIC, has more installation pathway options for modern autopilot systems, whether through the expanded STC landscape or through alternative approval routes, that's a genuine reason to wait for that clarity before committing to an installation under the current pathway if you're within a year or two of that clarity arriving. If your aircraft is solidly in the standard category regardless of what MOSAIC does, you're not waiting for a regulatory pathway that doesn't apply to you, and the insurance timeline is a more pressing factor than the regulatory one. Now let's move to engine modifications and the overhaul decision, because this might be where the post-MOSAIC uncertainty has the most acute practical consequences for owners making near-term maintenance decisions. The older certified aircraft fleet runs predominantly on engines that were designed and certified in an era when computing power, metallurgy, and fuel system engineering were dramatically less sophisticated than they are today. The fundamental architecture of a Continental IO520 or a Lycoming IO540 is genuinely old in engineering terms, and while these engines have accumulated an extraordinary track record of reliability when properly maintained, they represent a technology baseline that has significant room for improvement in terms of efficiency, reliability, and ultimately cost to operate. The alternative fuel engine conversion market, both diesel and alternative gasoline-powered, has been trying to serve this upgrade opportunity for years. and progress has been real, but slower and more expensive than early projections suggested, precisely because of the certification cost burden we talked about earlier. The MOSAIC adjacent regulatory modernization environment is going to have real effects on whether that market accelerates or continues to move slowly, and those effects flow directly into what your options look like when your engine reaches TBO in 2026 or 2027. Here's the specific scenario worth thinking through carefully. If you're within 2 to 3 years of engine replacement and your aircraft is in the weight range that will be affected by the MOSAIC expansion, you have a genuine question about whether to overhaul to the same engine configuration or start seriously evaluating alternative fuel or alternative engine options. The answer depends on a set of factors that are genuinely in flux right now, including how quickly specific alternative engine STC programs are likely to reach your airframe, whether the expanded MOSAIC-eligible fleet creates enough market pressure to accelerate those certifications, and what the avgas infrastructure picture looks like at your home airport over the same time horizon. What I would specifically caution against is treating this decision as simpler than it is in either direction. Assuming that an alternative certified engine option is imminent, and waiting to make a decision could leave you making a rushed call under time pressure when the TBO clock runs out. Assuming that the existing certified engine overhaul is obviously the right answer, without examining what the post-MOSAIC alternative fuel landscape might look like in 3 years, could mean paying for a major overhaul on aging technology when a better certified alternative is closer than you realized. The intellectually honest approach is to get specific. Contact the companies pursuing alternative engine STCs for your specific airframe and get a real timeline, not a marketing timeline, but an engineering and certification timeline, with milestones you can hold them to. Run a comparison of the total cost of ownership between an overhauled existing engine and the alternative, including fuel cost differences at your actual home airport and the airports you regularly fly to, installation costs, service network depth in the regions where you actually operate, and resale impact in both directions. And make the decision based on that specific analysis rather than on general impressions of which direction the market is heading. Let's talk about the insurance dimension more directly now, because everything we've covered so far has insurance implications, and the post-MOSAIC market is going to change the insurance landscape for older certified aircraft in ways that deserve their own treatment. Insurance underwriters are deeply, intensely attentive to certification status. They care about whether your aircraft modifications are STC'd and current. They care about whether your avionics are certified for the operations you're conducting, and they care about the regulatory framework your aircraft operates under, because that framework defines the safety oversight environment the aircraft exists in. When that regulatory framework changes significantly, which is what MOSAIC represents, underwriters have to recalculate their risk models, and that recalculation process is never instantaneous and is never perfectly smooth. For owners of older certified aircraft that are firmly in the standard category and not affected by MOSAIC eligibility, the near-term insurance implication is relatively straightforward. Your aircraft's regulatory status isn't changing, so the insurance recalculation process is less directly relevant to your situation. The bigger insurance dynamic for you is the ongoing industry trend toward requiring or crediting modern safety equipment, which we've already covered. For owners of aircraft that sit near the new MOSAIC eligibility thresholds, the insurance picture is more complicated and deserves real, specific attention before you make any decisions about how you're going to operate your aircraft or what modifications you're going to make. An aircraft that moves from standard category operation to MOSAIC-eligible light sport operation doesn't automatically have the same insurance product available to it, and the transition between regulatory frameworks can create ambiguity that some underwriters handle very differently from others. Before you make any assumption about what your aircraft's insurance situation looks like in the post-MOSAIC world, you need to have an actual conversation with a broker who specializes in GA. Not just a general aviation broker, but one who has specifically looked at how the MOSAIC transition is affecting policy language and underwriting criteria for the affected fleet categories. This is not a theoretical concern. Insurance policy language is written to specific regulatory frameworks, and when those frameworks shift, policy language that was written for the old framework may not map cleanly onto the new one. That gap, during the transition period, is exactly the kind of ambiguity that can create coverage disputes in the event of a claim, and a coverage dispute is not a situation you ever want to find yourself in, especially not as a result of a regulatory transition you could have anticipated and addressed proactively. There's one more dimension of the mosaic effect on older certified aircraft that I want to spend real time on before we start pulling this together, and that's the resale market dynamic over the 2 to 3 years following implementation. The used aircraft market is driven, more than almost any other factor, by the relationship between what a buyer can get for their money at any given price point. That relationship is dynamic and constantly shifting, and Mosaic shifts it in several ways simultaneously. First, by expanding the sport pilot-eligible fleet, Mosaic puts a wider range of aircraft in competition with each other for the sport pilot buyer. An aircraft that was previously in its own price segment because nothing else was eligible at that certificate level is now competing with a broader selection of used certified aircraft that the same buyer can legally fly. That's good for buyers and complicated for sellers, because the competitive landscape for used aircraft in the affected weight range just got more crowded. Second, the perception of the upgrade and certification pathway is a real factor in used aircraft pricing, and if buyers in the post-Mosaic market perceive that the regulatory cost of upgrading an older certified aircraft is going to be different going forward, cheaper in some categories, more expensive in others, they will discount or premium accordingly the current asking prices for aircraft in those categories. An aircraft with an expensive ST-seed panel that the market believes can now be replaced more cheaply via a new regulatory pathway is going to face downward price pressure on the ST-seed work specifically, even if the avionics themselves are excellent and current. The price pressure comes not from the quality of the work, but from the buyer's perception of what the same capability will cost going forward under the new regulatory environment. Third, and perhaps most practically important for owners who are planning to sell in the 2 to 4 years after Mosaic implementation, the transition period itself creates pricing uncertainty that tends to benefit buyers over sellers. When regulatory frameworks shift, buyers who are uncertain about what the new framework means for their investment hold out for lower prices as compensation for that uncertainty. Sellers who are operating in that same uncertain environment don't have clear comparables to anchor their asking prices to, because the market is recalibrating in real time. The net effect of that dynamic, historically across various aviation regulatory shifts, is that the transition period is not the best time to be a motivated seller of aircraft that are directly affected by the regulatory change. If you're thinking about selling an aircraft that falls in the Mosaic-affected weight range, the calculus on timing matters a lot. Selling before Mosaic implementation means selling into a market where the regulatory landscape is understood and comparables are clear, even if the Mosaic story is creating some uncertainty about future values. Selling into the peak transition period means selling when buyer uncertainty is highest and price discovery is most chaotic. Selling after the market has digested Mosaic and restabilized, which is probably 2 to 3 years after implementation, means selling into a clearer environment, but one where the value of your ST-seed work has been repriced in whatever direction the market has settled on. None of those options is obviously correct for every owner. The right answer depends on your hold costs, your mission needs, your financial situation, and how your specific aircraft maps onto the Mosaic changes. But understanding that timing choice exists and matters is the starting point for making it intelligently rather than by default. Let me pull together what all of this means practically for owners who are trying to make decisions right now, because I don't want this to end in the abstract when the specific takeaways are what actually have dollar value. If you own an older certified aircraft that sits well within the standard category and isn't going to be touched by Mosaic eligibility thresholds, your situation is the most stable of any owner group in this analysis. Your regulatory framework isn't changing, your ST-seed work isn't going to be perceived differently by underwriters, and your upgrade pathways are the same ones that existed before. The relevant question for you is whether the broader FAA regulatory modernization philosophy that Mosaic is part of is going to eventually produce a more efficient STC process for your class of aircraft, and the honest answer is yes, probably, but on a timeline measured in years rather than months. For practical upgrade planning purposes, don't hold off on legitimate safety and capability improvements while waiting for a cost reduction that may be 3 or 4 years away, especially if insurance trends are moving in a direction that makes those upgrades increasingly relevant to your coverage terms. If you own an aircraft that sits near the new Mosaic-eligible weight thresholds, you have the most complex situation and deserve the most careful analysis. You need to know specifically whether your aircraft will be eligible under the expanded framework, what that changes about your upgrade and installation pathways, what it does to your insurance options, and whether the expanded buyer pool creates real value appreciation for your aircraft that changes your upgrade investment math. Do not make assumptions in either direction here. Get specific data on your specific aircraft from people who have actually read the regulation in detail and understand where your airframe falls within it. If you're planning a significant upgrade, be it glass panel, autopilot, engine modification, or any combination, the most valuable thing you can do right now is get real quotes from real shops under the current regulatory framework so that you have a genuine baseline to compare against as the post-MOSAIC market develops. The worst position to be in is trying to evaluate whether post-MOSAIC prices are better or worse than before when you don't know what before actually costs in your specific situation. Benchmarking now gives you a reference point that has real decision-making value going forward. If you're thinking about the resale implications of MOSAIC for aircraft you own, get a realistic appraisal now, before the transition, from an appraiser who understands the MOSAIC story and can give you an informed view of how your aircraft is likely to be valued before and after. That pre-transition appraisal is genuinely useful context, whether you're planning to sell, planning to stay, or trying to decide which upgrades make sense to do before you put the airplane on the market. And regardless of where your aircraft falls in this landscape, have the insurance conversation now, specifically and deliberately, with a broker who has been tracking how MOSAIC is affecting policy language across different aircraft categories. Insurance is the variable in all of this that has the highest surprise potential, because it's the variable most owners address reactively when they need to rather than proactively when they should, and the post-MOSAIC transition period is exactly when reactive is most expensive. Here's the larger point I want to leave you with, because it's the thing that ties all of this together in a way that goes beyond any specific upgrade decision or timing choice. MOSAIC is not just a light sport story. It is a market structure story, and market structure stories change the economics of participation for everyone in the market, including people who don't think the specific rule change applies to them. When the rules about what can fly, who can fly it, and what it costs to certify modifications change significantly, the competitive dynamics of the entire marketplace shift, and those shifts determine what you pay for your upgrades, what your aircraft is worth to the next buyer, and what your options are when the major maintenance decisions arrive. The owners who come out of the post-MOSAIC transition in the strongest financial position relative to their peers are going to be the ones who did the work now, while the transition was visible and coming but not yet complete, to understand exactly how it applied to their specific aircraft, their specific upgrade plans, and their specific timeline. That work is genuinely available to anyone willing to dig into it. The regulation is public, the analysis from serious aviation law and regulatory shops is available, and the avionics and engine modification suppliers have real answers to give if you ask them the right questions about what the new landscape means for their STC programs. The owners who are going to find themselves caught flat-footed are the ones who treated MOSAIC as a news item about light sport aircraft, filed it away as not relevant to them, and continued making upgrade and resale decisions based on a market structure that will look meaningfully different in 2027 and 2028 than it did in 2023 and 2024. You don't need to be a regulatory attorney to navigate this well. You need to know which questions to ask, who to ask them to, and how to integrate the answers into the financial decisions you're already making about your airplane. That's what this channel is built to help you do, and it's exactly why we're going to keep covering MOSAIC, the upgrade market, the insurance landscape, and the used aircraft pricing picture, as all of this develops through the transition and beyond. Let me know in the comments what specific upgrade or certification decision you're wrestling with right now in the context of MOSAIC, because